Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on PCI DSS Business as Usual. My name is Kishore Vaswani. I'm the CEO of ControlCase, and I really appreciate the time you're taking today to attend this webinar on PCI DSS Business as Usual as it relates to IT compliance. A few housekeeping items before we get started. As we go through today's presentation, please feel free to put questions in the questions window, and we will make sure we answer them in the order we receive them after the webinar. The webinar is expected to run anywhere from 20 to 25 minutes, and so we should have enough time after the webinar for answering any questions that you may have. Certainly, please feel free to put questions on PCI DSS, on business as usual, or on any other IT compliance or security related matter. Also, as we go through our presentation today, please feel free to type in the chat window or the questions window if you have any difficulties in hearing me, or if you have any difficulties seeing the slides, and our moderators will be there to ensure that any audio and visual difficulties are addressed. A copy of the slides as well as a recording of this webinar will be sent to everybody early next week. Also, please feel free to go to www.controlcase.com to sign up for other future webinars and for viewing this recording in the future and any past webinars. Thank you again for attending, and let's get into our webinar. Our agenda today will be to talk a little bit about, about ControlCase, about PCI DSS. We will really spend a lot of time on deep dive into PCI DSS business as usual, and then we'll wrap up this webinar with some key implementation tips and continuous compliance. A little bit about ControlCase. So ControlCase focuses on certifications, specifically IT certifications and related continuous compliance services. Our key aspect as we work with customers is twofold. Number one, we are not your checklist auditor. We are your partners, and so we follow a partnership approach to certifications. And then we use technology and automation to ensure that wherever possible, we are making your lives easier as a customer by automation, efficiency, mapping of multiple regulations. And so certainly partnership approach, getting value to you by being a partner in the process, on-time certifications, and using automation to deliver our IT certifications and continuous compliance services is key to what we do. I know we're going to be talking about PCI DSS today, but here are a list of certifications that ControlCase plays in. That was a brief introduction to ControlCase. Now let's get into, before we get into the specifics of business as usual, I'll talk a little bit about PCI DSS. So PCI DSS is a standard that has been set by the PCI Security Standards Council. And PCI Council has established guidelines for any place where companies store, process, or transmit credit or debit card data. And so any place where credit or debit card data comes into play, security of that is the framework that establishes the security of that is the PCI DSS standard. And all the different brands, Visa, MasterCard, and other brands, really utilize the same common framework for information security of credit card data. At a very high level, PCI DSS is broken into 12 requirements, which can further be categorized at a higher level into 6 areas. The first one is around network and making sure that the network that's involved in storing, processing, and transmitting is secure. Number 2 is ensuring that cardholder data is protected, which means it is encrypted, whether in storage or in transmission. Number 3 is to ensure that there's a vulnerability management program so that applications are developed in a secure manner and that malware is not involved in the network where these applications are hosted. The 4th high-level area is access control, and that covers both logical access control, so things like user IDs, passwords, two-factor authentications, as well as physical security controls. After that is monitoring, and monitoring really flows into 2 high-level areas. One is monitoring of logs to ensure that things are happening properly. Number 2 is to ensure you're doing penetration tests and scans on an ongoing basis to identify and monitor for any weaknesses that may exist within the network. And then finally, there is maintenance of an information security policy, which is making sure that there are overall guidelines on how the enterprise operates as it comes to information security. So these were 6 high-level areas that are covered by PCI DSS. Let's get into the meat of our presentation, which is PCI DSS business as usual. So let's start with, before we get into the requirements, and there are 12 requirements as I had mentioned, and we'll talk about business as usual for each of these requirements. Let me first cover at a high level, what are the 4 guiding principles when it comes to business as usual. The first guiding principle really is to make sure that there is monitoring of security controls, which means things like intrusion detection systems, alerting, firewall monitoring, antivirus monitoring, and so forth has to be done on a periodic basis. Number 2, security controls, like any other technology, can fail, right? Log stop reporting, sometimes firewalls have misconfigured rule sets, antivirus agents and servers go down. And so ensuring that you are monitoring for any failures in the security controls themselves is the second aspect. So number 1, certainly you want to monitor. Number 2, if these technologies fail, you want to be monitoring to ensure you're looking at it and restoring them. Number 3 is changes to the environment. Any technology environment out there goes through changes. And so ensuring that you are reviewing changes to the environment is an important aspect. And then finally is periodic reviews. And when we say periodic, a common baseline really is quarterly, is a good estimate. And periodic reviews, whether it comes to access, whether it comes to configurations, whether it comes to walkthroughs for your physical security, CCTV, and other such aspects. Periodic review of controls is the 4th high-level area that covers business as usual. So 4 areas: monitoring of controls, ensuring any failures in controls are detected, reviewing changes, and then periodic reviews. Now let's dive a level deeper into each requirement, and then as we get into each requirement, I will talk at a higher level at each requirement level from a people, process, and technology perspective. And it's important to understand that business as usual really involves all 3 components. It involves cadency when it comes to process. It absolutely involves technology to make sure the right technology is implemented for monitoring. And then number 3, and the most important, people. You got to have people who are on top of the technology and the process. So let's start with requirement number 1, which is firewalls. And as I go through this, I will summarize what that requirement relates to when it comes to the PCI DSS standard. So the requirement 1, which is related to firewalls, is ensuring that a secure network is in place. It looks at things like DMZs for segregation of the web segment, from the internal segment, from the database, and things like that. So when you're talking about a secure network and firewalls, certainly making sure that you're doing periodic rule set reviews is an important aspect. Also, it's important that there be scans on a periodic basis to identify any unwanted avenues into the network from the outside. From a process perspective, every time there are firewalls, there are going to be rule set changes, because that's as technology and the environment changes, firewall rule sets will change. And having a good change control process is an important aspect of requirement one. And then from a people perspective, and you will hear this theme often, that a PCI project manager to escalate any non-compliances, making sure that there is a separate set of folks who are looking at changes and approving these changes and are identifying any unwanted changes and keeping an eye on the ball on compliance as a whole and PCI in particular is an important aspect. And that's a theme you will hear, which is the PCI project manager is an important aspect of any business as usual process. Requirement number 2 is related to making sure that the right hardening standards are there, making sure appropriate configuration scans are happening, and so forth. From a technology perspective, ensure that there is configuration scans happening to ensure that systems are hardened. That's the right PCI DSS requirement. From a process perspective, ensure that every time patches are released for security vulnerabilities, your base images are updated from a process perspective. And then number 2, the secure images are used for implementation of systems. And then from a people perspective, again, the project manager to ensure that any non-compliances are identified. Requirement number 3 talks about cardholder data and encryption. PCI DSS does require that you try to identify if there is unknown cardholder data lying somewhere. And so automated and periodic cardholder data scan reviews, as well as alerts in case of any new cardholder data found. These are technologies which are important to be identified on an ongoing basis. From a process perspective, all these technologies will result in false positives, and then being able to identify what the false positives are is an important aspect. Searching for cardholder data during rollouts of new systems is an important piece. And then again, a person needs to make sure they're managing any non-compliant situations through closure. The fourth one is protecting cardholder data in transmission, specifically ensuring things like unencrypted cardholder data not being transmitted in an insecure manner. To that degree, there is various data leak preventions or DLP solutions out there that would be able to identify such events. It's important to train people in this case to ensure that people know that clear text cardholder data should not be sent through emails, unencrypted, should not be sent through chats, and uploaded to insecure sites and things like that. So a training is a big part of the people side of, for this requirement. Requirement number 5 talks about antivirus and anti-malware. I think everybody's familiar, all of us use antiviruses, and so ensuring that antiviruses are consistently deployed, both to existing systems and new systems, as well as ensuring that there's a process to follow up that there is updates on the signatures happening is an important aspect from an antivirus perspective. Requirement number 6 requires that we use technology to ensure that applications that are deployed are developed and deployed in a secure manner. What that means is doing having application security scanning technology, making sure code reviews are happening, and there's a whole set of technologies out there for code reviews. In many cases, application firewalls form a big part of the puzzle because they ensure that to the extent there was some insecure code, they will block it at the perimeter. And so fairly deep technology bucket there from a secure applications perspective. From a process and a people perspective, ensuring that people are, again, trained on OWASP-like technologies. Developers should always go through secure coding technique trainings, making sure that there is segregation of duties between people who give access and control it. And then from a process perspective, any company that's developing applications or deploying applications probably has multiple environments, lower level environments like development, higher level environments, and which include production. And so migration of code and migration of application updates from the development environment to the staging environment to the production environment should follow a consistent process, which includes scanning and code reviews. Requirements 7 and 8 talk about access controls and user IDs. I think all of us are familiar with making sure that there are passwords, there's multi-factor authentication, and so forth. There's a lot of other regulations that also require this, but even from a PCI perspective, certainly making sure that you're reviewing access not only for whether the person is still employed, but also to make sure they have the right level of access on an ongoing basis is an important aspect. Requirement number 9 relates to physical security. And to that extent, physical security applies in some cases when you have data centers and locations. If you're in the cloud, it's the cloud provider's responsibility. But ensuring that you're on a periodic basis looking through things like CCTVs and badge logs, and ensuring that there's a process that if these things stop reporting, you are identifying it on a timely basis is an important piece. And then for every physical site you have, it is important to have a physical site coordinator from a people perspective. They could certainly have other responsibilities, and they probably will have other responsibilities, but having someone who's working with the PCI project manager and then being the physical security designee for that site is an important aspect. Requirement number 10 is around logging and monitoring. And there is, certainly logs are a voluminous activity, and so technologies absolutely have to be used out there, SIEM technologies, to monitor logs. Once you get from a process perspective, there should be a good process to identify and respond to alerts, B, triangulate those alerts with expected changes versus unexpected changes, and then making sure that these logs are available for 12 months. From a people perspective, again, you want to make sure that people are available. And this could be a combination of people and technology, but at the end of the day, people are the ones who are going to be responding to events 24/7 by 365. Requirement number 11 talks about vulnerability management. That would include making sure you have all the technologies out there to do various scanning. It's also important to have an asset management system or an asset list, because if you don't have an asset list, then it's easy for from a scoping perspective, it's easy for missing some assets to be scanned on a periodic basis. So from a process perspective, while you have the technology, you want to make sure that from a process perspective, you are every quarter ensuring you're upgrading your asset list to ensure any new assets are included. And then also doing some testing on the IDS, IPS in conjunction with the vulnerability scans and penetration tests. So making sure that the IDS and IPS does detect those events, and then you can use that as an exercise to run through your incident management process. And certainly to make sure that while you have a full IT staff that does, IT management, you want to have folks who are, the checks and balances to that IT management staff, and ensuring that they're looking at it from a scanning and a security perspective. The last requirement is on policies and procedures. The important technology to be used here is vendor or third-party management. And the important aspect there is to ensure that if almost every company out there uses third parties, and having a system to manage these third parties is an important aspect. From a process perspective, certainly make sure that the PCI requirements are tied to the procurement process of anything new product or service you're procuring, and then making sure there is close coordination between procurement and compliance personnel. So, as I said, we will be sending these slides as well as a recording. And as we get towards the end of this webinar, there's a few more sections, but certainly the checklist that I use through this presentation for the 12 requirements can be a tactical checklist you all can use to run through your process. Here are some of the key quarterly themes, as just to summarize, as you are implementing your periodic PCI process or any compliance process. Segregation of duties, making sure technology is operating, ensuring the right people are in place from a project management perspective, ensuring there's cadence and repeatability to the process. And that really ties back to the process part, and then the periodic reviews. Having a calendar of reminders is an important piece to which track back, and having dashboards is an equally important piece. So there's so many moving parts in PCI DSS, and especially if you have other regulations besides PCI DSS, it's a lot to keep track of manually. And so calendars and dashboards are an important aspect. Finally, as we end this presentation, let me talk a little bit about our continuous compliance offering. Certainly from our perspective, what we do as part of continuous compliance is to ensure that we are doing quarterly check-ins with customers on various things. Some are automated, some are manual. We have a checklist of questions that we use during our assessments. And from a continuous compliance perspective, what we do is we review those about 20 to 25 high-impact, high-risk questions. Some of those are technical. So we will take data from your vulnerability scanners and logs on a quarterly basis to make sure things are going good. Sometimes it's interview-based, where any new systems or technologies being implemented, we will make sure we are ensuring that that doesn't affect the compliance requirement. And essentially, we're trying to get to a point where it's a green or a red on an ongoing basis. So the continuous compliance piece eliminates the need for potential last-minute audit findings, reduces the effort of final audits, certainly implements business as usual. And from a technology perspective, our technology footprint allows us to do things like making sure that logs that should be reporting are still reporting, important assets are not missed, and so forth. Certainly, we use technology for all of this. And as I end my presentation, certainly feel free to reach out to us at www.controlcase.com if you have any questions on any of our IT certifications or continuous compliance services. As I started off earlier, at ControlCase, we follow a partnership approach to your certifications and use technology wherever possible. At this point, I will answer any questions that have come. And let me go through the questions one by one. The first question is around data that could be on backup drives. And the question is, what happens to the data that's on backup drives? Does anything need to be done about that? And if so, what? So when we talk about data on backup drives, there is multiple components how to look at it. The first is in the concept of how old is that data, right? So there's backups that are happening for, call it 2, 3, 4-year-old data, which is still live data. And then there is probably archives that exist from a decade back. The archives that exist from a decade back, obviously, to the extent they have any card data, that data will be invalid because those cards are expired. And so, first of all, you can kind of eliminate that. Now, the ones in the last 2 to 4 years that do need to be looked at, there are a couple of components to it. One, having, requirement number 9 of PCI DSS requires that there be tight controls when you're, to the extent you're moving backup media, to the extent it's physical and you're moving backup media to and fro, it needs to be appropriately tracked from a usual as well as a business as usual perspective. Of course, if it's electronic, it's all the security controls need to be in place. And in either case, when it's stored, it needs to be encrypted just in case something, just in case the backup tape or anything gets lost. So having a process to do these 2 or 3 things is an important aspect. The next question is around how does this business as usual relate to multiple regulations if you're doing things besides PCI DSS, and can that be integrated? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. To the extent, IT regulations kind of focus on similar things on an ongoing basis. So to the extent you are looking at multiple regulations, whether it's HIPAA, HITRUST, ISO, SOC 2, certainly making sure that you're reviewing the overall scope on a business as usual perspective is important. So, for example, if you have a cardholder data environment, and then you have a bigger, network that's in scope for ISO and SOC 2. Well, when you're looking at change control, you could look at all the different aspects, not just the cardholder data environment, and so that would then ensure that you're being efficient when it comes to business as usual controls across the board. The next question, and the last one that we have, is if we were to have a, when it comes to business as usual and PCI DSS and any regulation, the question is, if we add a new server or change our infrastructure, does the company have to recertify? And that answer generally is no. The certification and compliance is an annual activity. Things will happen in an environment. I talked about PCI DSS business as usual. So the important thing is when any change is happening, it's happening in a PCI DSS compliant manner. And so the regulations really ensure that any change management processes are followed and so forth. But typically, your validation of certification would happen only once a year. And then, but it's a good question in the sense that the business as usual activities, including this, such as adding a new server, would happen on an ongoing basis. But the certification still happens once a year. That was all we had. So I appreciate your time today for attending this webinar. Again, you will all receive a copy of these slides, a recording of this webinar. Please feel free to reach out to me. Reach out to www.controlcase.com for any past webinars and any upcoming webinars. Thank you so much and have a great rest of the day.